Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Ali Eslami, research scientist at Google DeepMind, speaks to Caroline Issa about the potential dangers and delights of AI.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here to Tank Magazine. And we're really excited to have Ali Eslami here from DeepMind. And Ali, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey and what you do at DeepMind.
So I've been at DeepMind for about 8 or 9 years now. And I've been doing AI since 2009 when I started my PhD. So my undergrad was in AI, my PhD was in machine learning. And at DeepMind, we've been looking at all sorts of AI topics, trying to push AI and then use it to do cool things.
That's helpful to know because my first question is there such a thing as artificial intelligence?
Right, so there's the short answer, which is yes, and then there's a longer answer. Okay, so the short answer is that yes, of course, artificial intelligence exists, firstly as a topic of study. Like it's a thing, people study it,
Right.
And therefore, sometimes when people refer to AI, they're referring to the field, and that definitely exists. Sometimes also they refer to an artifact, something that is artificially intelligent. And I think most would agree that forms of AI do exist. Now, people have different definitions for what an AI is, but for most definitions, we do have artifacts that are intelligent. Now, these intelligences tend to be quite narrow, so they might be focused on very specific applications like playing chess or playing Go or looking at images of CT scans and then detecting whether someone has a disease or not. It's a very narrow application.
And the most famous and probably sort of known from the public side of things.
Yeah, exactly. And so scientists and researchers, to distinguish this form of narrow intelligence with what we consider to be reminiscent of human intelligence, use the term artificial general intelligence, or AGI. Now, AGI is something that the field is working towards, and most agree that that does not exist yet.
AI, as you said, is a very general term for machine learning, artificial intelligence, and even the use of big data. But I would guess that they are totally different and use totally different methods to do very different things. How many distinct forms of artificial intelligence are there?
You can kind of think of computer science as being a field that has some overlap with artificial intelligence as a field. And the two of these have some overlap with machine learning as a field. So for instance, AI has been studied since the 1940s and 50s, right from when we first had invented computers. And most AI techniques use computers, but some are not concerned with computers at all. They might try to build AIs with biological systems or with even pipes and water, and some thought experiments go in that direction. And similarly, machine learning is a topic that is concerned with learning and data, but not everybody wants to use those techniques to build AI or to understand AI. Sometimes they want to just build an application or to predict something about the world that they find economically useful. Yeah, modern AI systems, so when you read in the news that someone's just designed a new AI that does something incredible, often the innovation that the researchers have made is to pick and choose just the right combination of techniques to demonstrate a capability that wasn't previously possible.
What do you mean by techniques?
So techniques it's a combination of things. So it could be, for instance, the algorithm that the system uses to learn from data. It could be the data set that it's learning from. It could be the algorithm that the system uses to demonstrate what it has learned. And nowadays we use neural networks a lot, and neural networks have so-called architectures, which is basically describing the way the neural network is connected to itself. So it's a little bit like saying, I have a brain. What does that brain look like? How is it connected? And what do I expose that brain to? And then what do I do with that brain after I've got it to learn? So a specific AI application, for instance, these chatbots that we're hearing about, is a combination of all of those factors.
So Ali, can you tell us what a neural network is then?
Right. So let's begin with machine learning. So machine learning is the idea that we want to get computers to do impressive and useful things, but we don't know how to describe the algorithm to the computer formally. So what we do instead is we show it lots of examples of that system, and the computer learns how to do it by itself. How it represents that learning is a topic of study, and one of the classes of representations that people have come up with over the decades is called the so-called neural network. Neural networks are just mathematical objects. They're not complicated at all, but they're inspired by the way the brain is connected. So basically, a neural network takes some input and it transforms it into an output. So for instance, it takes some pixels in an image and transforms it into the word cat or the word dog. And the neural network is describing how the pixels are transformed layer after layer to get to the word dog or cat. And the layers, the parameters of this network is what is tuned during learning by exposing it to data. So this structure of having many parameters, of having layers, is inspired by how we think the brain is structured, where we have neurons, many layers of them, that take sensory input, for instance, from our eyes and then connect it to the actions that we make with our tongues. But that's basically where it ends. So that kind of inspiration was there right in the beginning, in the 70s and 80s, and then it diverged into complicated techniques to train these neural networks.
So it started almost from like a replication of what humans do.
Totally.
To something completely non-recognizable to the way biology works.
Yeah, pretty much. And in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were really big debates about whether this was the right way to go. So the debates were called the debates between connectionists and people who were proponents of symbolic representations. So you might remember that a couple of decades ago, when we thought about AI, we used to think about knowledge trees. You know, we would say, what is a cat? A cat is an animal that has these properties. What is a dog? What is a mammal? And we'd imagine these large networks of knowledge. And they were very formal and they were very precise. And those are kind of symbolic representations. And connectionist representations would say there is no such thing as a formal representation of a cat. And it's all kind of intertwined in these neural networks. And so there was a big kind of debate over this for decades. And right now it seems like the connectionist neural network approach is winning. It's much more powerful, and all the applications you're hearing about in the past 10 years are neural networks.
So going back to AI, what are the sort of best tasks done by artificial intelligence?
They're pretty much everywhere nowadays. So for instance, when you go on TikTok and the algorithm decides what video to show you next, there's a neural network in the background that's looking at your previous behavior and trying to predict which videos you're going to enjoy watching. When you go on Google and you search for a topic, there will be neural networks that are analyzing the questions you're asking and trying to find relevant documents to show to you. And increasingly, for instance, when you go to the doctor and you have a CT scan or an MRI, there will be neural networks that look at those images and diagnose whether you have an issue, whether it needs to be escalated to a human doctor to look at, and so on. Self-driving cars, the algorithms that photo editing softwares use to make the images look better. So it's really completely everywhere. Some of the most impressive demonstrations, in my view, are where people have used neural networks to do things that were literally impossible before. So for instance, looking at the structure of proteins in our body, predicting what proteins look like, so then we can design new drugs. This is an example of something that no human brain has ever been able to achieve.
Wow.
And so if you use the same techniques with the right data, you can get capabilities that were simply just not possible before.
Has the time it's taken to discover the capabilities shortened? Is it constantly speeding up? Is it actually still taking the same amount of time? And what does that depend on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely feels like it's shortened. So if you look at time on the x-axis
Right.
and capabilities on the y-axis, what it kind of looks like is it looks as if we're going through an inflection point where all of a sudden, week after week, we're just kind of taking off tasks that AIs can do that previously they couldn't. And one of the reasons for this is we've begun to learn how to scale up our ideas and scale up the neural networks and the data sets in a way that wasn't technically possible before.
What does scale up a data set mean?
So for instance, not long ago, when I started in this field, when people talked about working with data, we would literally talk about hundreds or thousands of data points, like images. And as a PhD student, I had gone through every image. I had labeled it myself. I knew the images. Sometimes I'd call them names.
Wow.
So I was intimately familiar with the data set. Now, the most impressive systems that we're training now, they can be trained on hundreds of billions of data points. So for instance, these chatbots, they have read pretty much every document ever uploaded to the internet. And the fact that we can even think of running an algorithm on that scale of data is something that simply wasn't possible. So it requires immense hardware resources, it requires software infrastructure, but it also requires ideas and algorithms that could even be applied to that amount of data and do something useful. And that know-how has been developed over basically the past 10 years.
So the billions and billions of pages that an algorithm is filtering through of like anything that's ever existed on the internet. Why? Is it just because that data has always been there? Is it just now that the hardware, like all these things that you've talked about, are finally sort of more available and ready to use in order to have these huge data sets?
Yeah, so it's a combination of the hardware and the algorithm itself.
Okay.
So, so basically, let's dig into this a little bit deeper. You have a neural network, and this neural network is doing a pretty simple task, which is given a sequence of words, is trying to predict the next word. So if I say, my name is Ali and I work at, it will try to predict the word DeepMind.
Right.
Okay. So that's the task. It took researchers many years to identify that as being a useful task.
Right.
But let's say we know that that's the task we want to do. So we have a neural network. It's trying to take those words and to predict the next word. This neural network, we've also learned that the bigger we make the network, so the more parameters it has, the more layers it has, the better it will be able to do this job. And it's getting to the point where we're training networks with trillions of parameters that you wouldn't even be able to store on a normal computer or a normal data center. So you need buildings the size of warehouses to even run this neural network.
Wow.
And then what the algorithm does is it takes a document from the internet, it splits it up into two chunks, the words that go into the input and the words that it's trying to predict. And then it shows it to the neural network makes a guess, and when it's incorrect, it adjusts the trillions of parameters a tiny, tiny bit to be less wrong. And then you repeat this for every new document. So the process of storing the neural network and exposing it to that amount of data requires immense kind of foresight and courage, but also hardware resources.
Right.
And nowadays, training a single one of these neural networks, just in terms of the compute costs, you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, just a single one.
Wow.
So you need to have a lot of conviction that this thing is a worthwhile investment of money. And that's why so few labs can do it.
Right. And that's why there's so few players that are sort of
Exactly,
bringing
yeah.
out product from this. You talk about researchers determining, what the right questions and even inputs are. So human intervention is still incredibly important at this point. Will AI always need human supervision and intervention?
Basically, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, these systems, they are human artifacts. They literally sit on a particular computer, and there's a large number of human minds that work together extremely hard to build them. At the same time, though, these systems, they are able to do more and more as they become more and more capable. So for instance, one of these neural networks, it might be able to talk to you about physics, but it can also talk to you about literature. It can also do calculations. It can tell the difference between cats and dogs. Recently, we've heard that they can pass law exams, they can pass high school maths exams, and so on. So it definitely feels like they're becoming more and more capable. At the time being, they are completely under our control because they are kind of in quarantined situations where the humans say, okay, we're just studying this artifact and trying to understand what it does. Now, if society goes in the direction where we give these systems power over our lives, for instance, if we connect them to the stock market, or if we connect them to decision-making systems around insurance or the criminal system, then at that point we might find ourselves in a situation where we can't easily switch it off. Not because we can't unplug it, because we'll always be able to, but because the human systems built around it need that thing to continue running. Much like the stock market. Like, you can't really switch off the stock market now,
Right.
because the economy would collapse.
Right. So is AI capable of developing better AI, and should we let it?
In theory, it's possible. And in fact, there are examples of this happening. So a really good example of this is AIs that play games.
Right.
So for instance, if you think about chess, chess is a game that's played between two people. And the best AI systems that play chess, historically, they began by imitating what humans did. So we would show it how expert humans would play chess. The AI would try and mimic those moves. And then we found that, yeah, they can do this very competently. They can mimic human play. And then what researchers did was they allowed two AIs to play against each other. And they could play millions and millions of rounds of chess in a matter of minutes or hours or days. And what people have found is that by playing against itself, it can achieve a competency as chess that is higher than any human.
Right.
And so in a sense, you can say that the AI has trained itself to be better at this thing than a human was. And the same idea can apply in lots of other domains. Not in every domain, because many interesting tasks are inherently human tasks. So they will always involve a human.
So give me an example of a domain where that it could still work, AI against AI, to make it a better than a human intervention, sort of AI trained.
So for instance, again, let's talk about, so the more formal the system is, the more well described it is by formal logic, I think the computer has a better shot at doing this thing. So for instance, the stock market, again, if you had an AI that was buying and selling stocks and it was just trying to maximize its portfolio, then you could imagine systems that learn to do this very well without the involvement of humans. But if you're talking about cultural things like making movies or writing books or conversing with humans, I can't imagine a scenario where computers would just play with themselves to get good at that. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is how humans feel about it and how humans interact with it. And so there, I think there will always be humans and AIs kind of interacting with each other.
But it sounds, Len, that like something that's very cut and dried around sort of mathematics, statistics, and possibility versus emotion and opinion and taste is still very much where the divide is around kind of the maximizing of AI's potential.
And it's precisely bridging this gap that feels like is happening right now that is creating so much excitement.
Right.
And it feels like, and we could be wrong about this, but it feels like these AIs, by reading so much human literature and human artifacts, are beginning to understand a little bit about the nuances of those kind of things that we've always thought to be completely cultural, completely within the human domain. So for instance, you may have seen these AI systems that can produce images. And there was a really fascinating experiment someone had done where they had asked the system to produce superhero villains and heroes for all the countries on the planet. So they were like, what would a villain look like if it was from Russia? What would it look like if it was from the US? What would it look like if it was from China? And it was really amazing to see that the AI would kind of incorporate so many cultural nuances when it was constructing that hero, for instance. So for instance, in China, there'd be certain colors that would be used, certain visual characteristics. And then for, I don't know, South Africa, they'd be very different. And the construction of that image is incorporating everything that we've built as a community about that country. And those nuances can only be captured if you've read everything, basically.
Right. Yeah. But effectively, those nuances are also only the nuances that exist on the web.
Yes.
Right.
So importantly, these kinds of systems that I'm describing, the ones that only read, they have never experienced what it's like to have a body. They've read about it, but they've never taken an action in the physical world. They've never experienced what it feels like to fall in love or to kind of have a limb severed or whatever. You know, there's a scene in Good Will Hunting where the teacher character is arguing with the student character, Matt Damon's. It's Robin Williams and Matt Damon. And Robin Williams says to Matt Damon that, oh, you think you're so smart. You think you've read all the books in the world. But do you know what the Sistine Chapel smells like? And then he says, oh, hang on, yeah, I don't know what it smells like. I don't have that kind of connection to it. And these chatbots are exactly like that. They've read everything, but they've never really existed. And certainly they haven't really read about a world in which they exist. Right. But that's beginning to change because we're writing about them, and then now they're reading the things we're writing about them, and it's getting a bit trippy.
It's very meta. So what makes one chatbot AI better than another chatbot's AI?
So there's two ways of looking at this. One is to just look at the dimensions of the neural network, and then the other one is to measure its capabilities. So in terms of the dimensions of the neural network, one very important metric is how many parameters does it have. So the smaller the neural network, the fewer parameters it has. We've learned it will be less capable. And the more parameters it has, it will be more capable. And so far, we haven't hit a ceiling. So we're finding that if you can double the number of parameters, you can predict very accurately how much more capable it will be, which is incredible on its own. So that's one. That's a very dry way of looking at it. But if you then go and measure its capabilities, you get a more nuanced understanding. So what do I mean by that? Basically, you get them to sit lots of tests, just like a human would. They do maths exams, law exams. You ask them questions about culture, about history, about the human condition. And we're talking thousands and thousands of these tasks. And you measure the accuracy with which they answer questions. You compare it to humans. And you look at whether they're getting better or worse. And that's another way that you can compare these chatbots. You can see how much does it really know about law? How much can it kind of reason when I give it a new situation? Then there's a third, which is perhaps, again, more nuanced, which is you might have two chatbots that are equally capable of, in terms of being able to answer questions, but they can have different personalities or biases. So one might be more friendly than another. One might be more inquisitive than another. One might be left-leaning or right-leaning. I think we're beginning to enter an era where different companies and different organizations differentiate themselves by leaning on this personality aspect.
Right.
So they say, you know, my chatbot has the same number of parameters as your chatbot, but I've given it extra instruction to be more pleasant to deal with,
Right.
to be more friendly when it's interacting with you. And it's a really interesting world.
Hearing this, I understand that the inputs are key. And you mentioned when you were doing your PhD, you were actually tagging individually your thousands of inputs. And now as we allow sort of neural networks to sift through the billions of pages that exist on the web, there is very little ability to tag quality versus quantity. So how is AI and neural networks dealing with even understanding what's good quality input versus bad quality input and all the bias that exists in the billions of pages that we'll never lay our own eyes on or be able to judge?
Yeah, that's a really key question right now, and it's perhaps it's the billion-dollar question of the moment. And I would say about 1 or 2 years ago, there was this related open question, which was if we want to build useful conversation agents or chatbots, do we only train them on the good content on the internet and keep them safe from the bad content?
Right.
Like, let's say we all agree that racism is bad, so we're trying to identify racist content and just not expose it to the system.
Right.
So do we do that? Do we make sure that it's not exposed to racist content? Or do we allow it to read both non-racist content and racist content, but then instruct it to never be racist, to tell it that we have a value judgment that racism is bad? I think what everybody is doing now is the latter. So you train on everything you can get your hands on, and that means that the system knows how to be politically correct, but it also knows how to be racist, and it also knows how to be sexist, and it knows how to be very foul-mouthed, and so on and so on. But then you get it to do practice conversations with thousands and thousands of humans, which then tell it what is good and what is bad. They kind of direct it into a scenario where it's being helpful, it's not being racist, it's not being sexist, etc., etc. And this is really interesting because it also itself becomes a slightly political question, which is who is the arbiter of good and bad?
Yeah. And who are the thousands of people interviewing?
Exactly. And what kinds of instructions have they received?
Right. How do we ensure that the benefits of AI are evenly distributed across society as a whole rather than concentrated in the hands of the very few and powerful?
Yeah, so like any technology, it can be used for good things or bad things, and it also creates power dynamics that perhaps are new for society. There's a group of people, researchers, who are trying to push the technology for because they feel like it can be used for useful things. And there's also a question around kind of intellectual curiosity about what is intelligence, how does it relate to the brain, and how can we replicate it. So that will always happen. But then to make sure, as you said, that it's used in equitable ways, in fair ways, and it benefits everybody, I think it's really important that more people get involved in the business of designing these things, using these things, and regulating these things.
And when you say more people, who do you mean?
Exactly. So we need designers, we need philosophers, politicians, artists, to understand this and to kind of create all that is necessary to try and make this a useful thing. So it's really kind of out there now in society, and the scale of the questions is far beyond what any single organization can answer, certainly far beyond any single individual can answer. So I think that's really what's necessary. And on one hand, one way to do it is to ensure that the people who are building these systems, the organizations that are building these systems, they have diverse viewpoints, and they have people involved in the design of these systems that aren't just computer scientists and AI scientists, but social scientists, political scientists, artists, and so on. But then also to educate people outside these systems so that they understand the implications soon enough to be able to put in safeguards and guardrails. And in particular, I think politicians have a big part to play in this, and also artists. In a sense, I think artists can play a big role in communicating what's happening and what the opportunities are and what the risks are.
When you talk about artists having a big opportunity in helping to lead this conversation around using AI in positive ways, are you thinking of painters? Are you thinking of musicians? Are you thinking of poets? Like, in what sense are you sort of defining artists?
Yeah, absolutely, everything. So in my view, this is a very personal take, but I think the study of artificial intelligence is really the study of ourselves. It's applied philosophy, in my view. And I think many of the famous philosophers that we read about, like Plato and Descartes and Wittgenstein, I think they would have all been AI researchers if they were alive today, because it's our way to understand ourselves and to figure out what it is that makes us the interesting beings that we are. You know, the reason we have society, we have culture, we have art, we have language, we have dance, music. The only reason we have any of these things is because of this organ in our heads called our brains. Other animals don't have these things to the same extent. So AI is really curious about that question. And so with that hat on, you can think, oh, wow, we're building these artifacts, and this is giving us evidence towards this question that we've been thinking about forever. And we can use that to understand ourselves better. Just like an analogy I like making is to photography. Back in the 19th, 18th centuries, I think, when photography started becoming a thing, it had a profound impact on painting. But now, I think when we look back, we understand that it taught us more about what it means to do visual art. We realize that it's not just about capturing reality accurately, but it's also about conveying emotion. It's about capturing color. You have abstract art. So it's kind of enriched that space, I think. And I think the same thing can and will be done in all of life.
I think many of us in this room, listening to you, I mean, I know I'm surprised at sort of the way that you talk about artificial intelligence and how more as an artifact, and how actually it's sort of helping to define humanity in a way. And I know in my simple knowledge of AI, which is why we're talking to you, you know, AI for me is something that takes us leaps and bounds into the future with sort of capabilities of sort of expanding knowledge, expertise, solutions, biological and technological, to places we can't even imagine yet, which makes me look more forward versus as sort of artifact. And I would love to understand how right now, you know, you're working with AI and sort of the projects that you're working on that are getting you really excited about future artifacts, I guess.
Yeah, so for instance, the project that I spend most of my time on right now is using AI for quantum physics. So we're trying to use these technologies, neural networks, big data sets, large computers, exactly the same technologies, to simulate the way in which atoms interact with each other. Okay. And if you can do this well enough, then you can basically predict how materials will behave, and you can use that to design better batteries, to design better solar cells, to design drugs, to design structures that are cheaper, more economically viable, more environmentally friendly, and so on and so on. So this is one very particular application of this stuff towards problems that really have the potential to change our lives in the future. So this is really going away from the philosophical aspect of it to the technological aspect and thinking, okay, how can we build a better future with this stuff? And in this sense, it very much is an artifact. You're literally talking about, one system that once you've designed it, hopefully once we've built this, that you can give to scientists and then they can use it to do their work, to design better batteries for your cars, etc.
Yeah, just going back to what you were saying earlier about the way that, and you used racism as an example for how we're teaching AI about sort of social taboos, I suppose. It strikes me that how you describe teaching the AI is also how we teach children, which is that they absorb the sort of cultural phenomenon of racism, and then you apply a taboo over the top. And then the result of that seems to be that it's expressed often in what is called unconscious bias. So I was wondering if there's a similar phenomenon happens with AI, and if there is, whether that means the AI has an unconscious.
Okay, so there's two parts to that. I think the phenomenon of unconscious bias does exist in these AIs in a very similar way to it exists in humans, as you've described. And that can happen in at least two different ways. One is, as you said, the so-called culture that it's exposed to as it's training. Whether or not it sees certain content will affect what it thinks of, how it defines racism in the first place, implicitly. And then in the second stage, where we give it that taboo, as you said, that also has its own biases, because that taboo is defined by its interactions with those thousands of raters. And both of these processes have the potential to create biases. Not only do they have the potential to create biases, they almost certainly will, because you're never defining racism neatly in a box, just like it is with humans. Now, the second part of your question, does that mean that it also has an unconscious? I think that's a very different question, and a very difficult one to answer. I think that fits squarely within the realm of philosophy. Like, what does it even mean to have consciousness? Do these systems have consciousness or not? People talk about sentience. Are these things sentient or not? My personal view is that they're not conscious and they're not sentient. I don't really have the philosophical expertise to explain why I feel that way, but I really don't think these things have those properties. And then the other thing I'd say is that this topic of bias and fairness and the ethics of AI is actually an extremely hot topic right now. And you have ethicists, philosophers, and AI researchers whose entire research careers are built around this. And so their expertise is precisely this topic. I'm personally the kind of AI scientist who has focused mostly on increasing their capabilities. But there are many extremely talented people who think very hard about, okay, how do we make sure that they don't have these biases, or we minimize these biases? How do we ensure that they are fair to the extent possible? And also, how do we build the frameworks to even think about this? Because it's a very new realm.
Nell described the way in which you teach against racism as an example, as akin to how children learn about racism. Are there other methods of training against those kind of biases that have been tried? And if they have been tried, why have we ultimately settled on this version? And even do you agree with that analogy in the first place?
I think broadly the analogy is an accurate one. And in terms of have other methods been tried at this high level of conversation, I would say that this is pretty much the only thing that has been tried. Now, there are many differences in the details. For instance, do you have one system that is trying to figure out what racism is and not be racist? Or do you have two systems, one which speaks its mind freely and then another one which decides what is allowed to get out or not? And you might imagine having two different neural networks that are taking on these two responsibilities. You can ask questions around, does it learn through interacting with humans what racism is, or does it learn through reading books about racism specifically? So there's open research questions, but at the high level, I would say that it is a fair analogy.
So many years ago, I spoke to a man called Yaron Lanier. I don't know if you know who he is.
No.
So he was one of the early authors of operating systems to computers. And his particular interest was to bring in audio, digitized audio. I think he did MP3. He invented MP3. And he spent the rest of his life kind of, according to him, according to our interview, regretting what he'd done because he felt MP3 created a sort of filter from henceforth all musical culture was reduced by, because the filtration, which was basically a condition of the technology, kind of, in his mind, handicaps future musicians and musologists, because they only work with the bandwidth that MP3 kind of tolerates. So I feel like in a much more profound way and across a broad range of topics, we have this possibility of reducing ambiguity with the best of intentions. For example, guarding against political incorrectness and prejudice and stuff. And because if AI is established as a tool for creatives, eventually, as it is already almost, then who's going to be writing the Lady Chatterley's Lover or the transgressive, annoying, terrible thing, which will nevertheless, we might look back in future and consider it a cultural treasure. So if you're introducing filtration, how do you protect against it being too limiting or limiting? Or how do we? Because initially, but he described that maybe it's old technology, but software was built like a pyramid, and MP3 was like a block at the bottom of the building, so you could never pull it out because too many things were built on top of it. But maybe that doesn't hold anymore, or does it?
I completely agree. I think there's a number of topics to discuss in this question. One, of course, is that like any field, AI research is driven by trends and by hype. And the fact that all of a sudden we're spending so much time talking about language and the internet and so on is definitely influenced by that. In the 80s, if you were in Japan, everyone was talking about robots and action. And in the 90s, if you were in California, people were talking about different things. And at the moment, this is the domain of intelligence that we're seeing largest gains in, and that's why everybody's talking about it. But as you say, this is still a very small part of general intelligence, even though it is more general than things we've had in the past. The second part is to talk about, okay, how do we ensure that society as a whole remains innovative and diverse and creative when you have tools inside it that are restricted? And I think that humans have demonstrated time and time again that they will figure out the answer to this question. So just because we have a tool that is opinionated in one way, I'm hopeful that society will adapt to ensure that there will be humans who write interesting new novels, that do transgressive art, and so on and so on. So I think that should hopefully remain the case, because it's always been the case. I think that's perhaps, in fact, the only thing that we're good at. And then the third part is, yes, like if we have these technologies and then we build more and more technologies on top of them, are we restricted by this foundational layer? And I think that is a very big risk, and I think it's a possibility, and that's why there is so much action and energy around these language models. In fact, they do call them literally foundation models. There was a paper from Stanford 2 or 3 years ago where the term foundation model was used for these systems. Because, as we discussed, very few people can build these systems. The opinions of those people matter greatly in the way these systems behave. And once you've built it, you're going to start building lots of things on top of it. And those things will be subtly and dramatically influenced by how that thing in the bottom layer was trained. So, for instance, its political views might end up influencing the way your calendar is organized in a couple of years' time. Its political views might end up influencing the way in which your car drives in a couple of times. And so those things are really key to get right. And again, going back to like the earlier conversation around politicians and larger society getting involved, it's really critical that those voices and those viewpoints are involved in the training of these systems now, because it's a little bit like when the media industry was set up. Those initial drives can be very difficult to undo over time because they become, the culture.
Well, I guess, I don't know, maybe you already covered this, 'cause I came in a little late, but how do you see the future evolution? Like, what is the pace of change? I mean, for many people, ChatGPT was the kind of first that they encountered AI systems that they, it's suddenly on, people's agenda in a way. But I mean, how are things going to look in a year or in 10 years? Because, I mean, is it an exponential rate of change? And is there a moment at which these systems, I mean, as you were talking about these building layers upon layers, I mean, become sort of unwieldy and unmanageable from the perspective of a human? I don't know. What do you think?
It's difficult to predict the future, as always, but it doesn't feel right now like we have, that we're plateauing. So at the moment, it feels like the capabilities of these systems are exponentially increasing. At the same time, it definitely doesn't feel like it's problem solved. So I think most people would agree, most researchers would agree, that we don't have all the ingredients and we just need to kind of make it bigger, and then we'll have like superhuman AI that does everything for us. There are some serious unknowns too. In particular, with regards to how these things interact with the real world, especially when they're embodied, when they have, physicality. Those are very open questions, but also questions around fairness and politics and morality that we've been discussing. I think there's also the possibility that we are in a hype phase right now, and in the next few weeks and months, we discover that actually these things, whilst very cool, are also flawed in very serious ways. I would say that we're beginning to see a similar thing, for instance, with self-driving cars, where it felt like there was a lot of progress initially, but now we're realizing that closing that final gap can be very tricky and very time-consuming. So the same thing might happen, and therefore we might put our attention on the next shiny thing, which captures our imagination. But I think the fundamental ideas are really here to stay. So the idea that we probably will end up using data sets on an internet scale to bootstrap understanding of human culture and human language, I think that's here to stay. I don't think that's really going to be replaced by anything. And I think it's really exciting. The kinds of problems that this approach has solved are problems that smart humans have been thinking about since the 1940s. Alan Turing wrote about exactly this stuff, in the Turing test. And so it's a really exciting time to be alive and to be able to think about these things, because in the past 80 years, let's say since Turing, there really wasn't any tangible way to start tackling some of these problems. And now we have that. And so there's a lot of excitement.
I thought it was funny when you were trying to come up with things that the AI couldn't experience. Your mind jumped from falling in love to having a limb severed. I was wondering whether the AI, if it was like listening to you as you're chatting with it, is it capable of psychoanalyzing you? And if it is it just that it's sort of parsing everything you say through like some combination of rule books of psychoanalysis, or does it come up with a model of psychology as it's talking to you?
Different people have different views on this. My view is that yes, it can psychoanalyze me, and my view is that it does have a model of psychology that it's using. And the more convincing the conversations become, the more I will believe this. In the same way that when I go to a therapist and I talk to that therapist, I really don't have any way of investigating what's going on in their brain. All I know is that they're saying sensible things, and I see a plaque on a wall that tells me that, they've studied something at university, and I just trust that they know what they're talking about. I think to some extent, we're beginning to enter that era too, where we have systems that are clearly useful, but they're doing what they do in questionable ways, questionable in the sense that we don't really understand how they're doing it. And so, I think in my view is that it is doing those things. And it's not that different from when I interact with any other human.
As AI continues to automate more processes, do you think it's realistic that we're heading towards a world of reduced work and more leisure time?
I think it's possible, but historically that hasn't seemed to have materialized. So since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this idea that technology would give us more leisure time has been around, and serious philosophers and thinkers have been writing about it. In practice, that doesn't seem to have materialized, though, since whenever we had extra productivity, we just used it to make more stuff and to kind of work just as hard to live more and more luxurious lives. I think, given how it has happened historically, the same is likely to happen, in my view. But again, that's a decision that society can make. That's one of the things that's great about being alive, is that we can inform that decision. So it could be the case that society at this point decides, actually, the level of, the quality of life that we have is good enough, at least in certain parts of the world, and this extra productivity we're going to use to reduce inequality and to increase leisure time. That sounds amazing. We'll see if it happens. But I think likely we will just use that to keep on working harder and making more stuff.
Thank you so much, Ali Eslami, for sharing your knowledge and your expertise around the rapidly changing AI world. So I think we're going to have you back for part 2, given the rate of change. But thank you again so much.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.